The first section or heading in chapter 1 is going to be your chapter introduction. While this is the first section that appears in the chapter, more times than not, it's one of the last 2 sections to be written. It's hard to write this section if you haven't written the rest of it yet. Remember, an introduction gives a preview of what's coming, then you have the content, then you have a conclusion that kind of wraps up what you already provided in that narrative. So if you think about this early on, just realize that the first section is the section that you're going to write near the end. It provides a high-level focus into what the situation is and the need for research. As you go through writing this section in chapter 1, I want you to think about the person who reads this section in your chapter 1 and may never decide to read the rest of your work. He or she is looking for that preview. They're looking for enough information to decide, do they want to continue on reading your chapter? And so therefore, that's why you want to be relevant. You want to be very specific and succinct, because if they don't get past this section, they may not even go into the next section. That preview of what's in the chapter is going to be given at certain perspectives of what's the problem, and then what the purpose of your work is, and then a little bit about the nature of the study and what other sections or headings one can expect to find in your chapter. So think of it as a very quick preview. If you only had a few minutes to tell somebody what was in your chapter, what's the most important things you would want them to know? And those are the things that I'm going to share in this lesson. As I indicated, this is one of the last sections, and often it's written after the conclusion. If you write all the content out, all the other headings in chapter 1, then it's easy to write the conclusion. Then you can go back to the introduction and write what is actually in your work. And it's a good way then to parallel both the introduction and conclusion, because they should be somewhat similar, although I do prescribe that the introduction section might be 3 or 4 paragraphs, whereas the conclusion might be 1, maybe 2 paragraphs only. Ideally, I find the chapter introduction only needs to be 3 or 4 paragraphs, no more than 1.5 pages. If you're going to have 2 full pages, perhaps. But I have seen dissertations, even from my own mentees, that were 2 paragraphs and 1 page, but most of them tend to be about 2 or 3 paragraphs, a page to a page and a half. If you remember, a good paragraph is anywhere between 3 and 7 sentences that's written on a specific topic or subject. So as you start to write this, I'll show you what I prescribe as 2 paragraphs. If you decide you need more than 2 paragraphs, then that's up to you. You can decide what you want. But I do encourage you that if you have more than 4 paragraphs, if you're more than 2 pages, you might be putting in too much information. Remember, this is a concise preview of what's to follow in the chapter. In the first paragraph, this is the content that I prescribe you put in there. And I found great success by looking at these 3 things to include in the first paragraph. Provide 1 or 2 sentences from the background of the problem. Now, if you haven't listened to the background of the problem section yet, that lesson that I provided, the background is an overview, which is 3 or 4 pages, but it provides some insight into how the problem came to be what it is today. It has perhaps a bit of a historical overview, maybe it's given some trends on what's occurred, but ideally, in this section, you're going to take 1 or 2 sentences from the background, and I'll share an example with you. The example I'll use that in the United States, for about the last 50 years, the small business failure rate has been about 50% in the first 2 years from when they start up. And that statistic goes up to 70% by its 5th year. If you were going to look at the background of the problem, you would only have to provide here some insights at how in the United States in the last 50 years the small business failure rates has been 50% in the first 2 years, and that it goes up to 70% in the 5-year period. You don't have to go about a rationale here. You don't have to provide that information. You just have to state what's happening so that the reader can get a perspective of what you're addressing. Then include 1 or 2 sentences related to the general problem. The general problem is part of the problem statement, and in that lesson I shared how you should have a general overview of what's going on holistically. So you may want to be able to suggest here, based on the concept of what I indicated with the small business failure rates, is that because of the small business failure rates, the general problem is that those who start businesses who fail often have to file foreclosure, bankruptcy. Some of them actually are demoralized. They lose confidence in themselves. There's a lot of things that happen. Also, we find that if they have hired employees, they have to let employees go, so then the unemployment rate goes up. And there's just this spiral, if you will, of downward problems that happen when a business starts and then fails. So that's what you could allude to in the general problem in just one or two sentences. You don't have to, again, give the rationale. Just indicate what some of the concerns are. And then one or two sentences on the specific problem. In the case of the example, now we're going to show how the problem that you talked about in the background and the general problem is being realized in the survey population. In Denver, Colorado, for example, the small business failure rate exceeds the national average by 6%. In Denver, Colorado, the small business failure rate is 56% in the first 2 years. That's what you might want to allude to in this section here. And that way the reader sees that what's the problem. They see for the last 50 years the small business failure rate has been 50% in the United States. They start to see some of the impact of that in the general information. Now specifically you start to show that Denver, Colorado exceeds the national average. And so now you see a very specific problem, and it lets the reader know by doing it this way, a good consumer of research, as they read your work, will start to realize that your study is going to be done on small business failure rates, something to do with that, and more than likely it's going to be in Denver, Colorado, because that's what you wrote about. Now if we move to the second paragraph, think of the second paragraph now as giving a little bit more insight into what the study is going to be about. So here you might allude to the purpose of the study. Now you don't have to cut and paste the purpose statement that's in a section that follows later in chapter 1. In the purpose statement, I shared insights in that lesson about how to craft what kind of study you're going to do as far as the research method and design, what's the variables if you're going to have variables, or if you're going to do a case study or phenomenological study, what are some of the focus or the themes that you're going to be using, and the unit of analysis. Here you may just want to suggest in the introduction section that the purpose of your study is to gain insights from successful business leaders who have not failed in the first 2 years, because those people may have success factors you want to identify and therefore help others later as they start their businesses. So you don't have to, again, copy and paste information from the purpose statement. Just give a general statement here, and you don't need to cite anything. You might also, in this sense, give some sort of indication of what the research method and design is that your study is going to employ. Give some indication of the stakeholders who may potentially benefit from your study. Now, if you haven't done this section in chapter 1 later, which is titled Significance of the Study section, if you haven't listened to that lesson yet, you might want to listen to that lesson, because in that section I alluded to 3 different stakeholders that you want to talk about who potentially can benefit from your study. So in this section you might want to take 1 or 2 of them and just allude how others can benefit from your study. Particularly in this case, those new prospective business owners who may start businesses up in the future, that if they see your study and learn what other successful business owners have done, then it will help them to be more successful than they might be otherwise. And then allude to the major headings in the chapter. The major headings in a chapter would be headings such as the nature of the study section, the significance, the theoretical framework. This would not be what I consider to be the minor headings, which I tend to call out to be the definition sections, or the limitations of the study section, or the delimitations, or the conclusion that's going to end the whole chapter. Here, with one sentence, you can kind of allude to other information in this chapter that you will find that's critical to this research study will be the purpose statement, the nature of the study section, the research questions, and perhaps the theoretical framework, something like that. But you wouldn't give a wash list of everything that's left to be described in the chapter. Taking the B out of all but dissertation for chapter 1.